There is a famous story often told about the Moravians. In the 1700s, two young men stood on the deck of a departing ship as it slowly pulled away from the harbour. Behind them, their families watched from the shore, many knowing they might never see them again. The two men were sailing to the Caribbean to preach the gospel to enslaved people who had never heard the name of Christ. The conditions were brutal, disease was common. Life expectancy for missionaries there was extremely short. As the ship drifted farther from the dock, one of the young missionaries lifted his voice and shouted back toward the crowd, "May the Lamb that was slain receive the reward of his suffering." That single sentence captured the heart of the Moravians. They were ordinary people, but they carried an extraordinary devotion. For more than 100 years, this small Christian community kept a prayer meeting going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without interruption. And from that prayer meeting came one of the most powerful missionary movements the world had ever seen. In today's video, we're going to uncover the incredible story of the Moravians people who prayed day and night for 100 years, and what happened next changed the course of Christian history. But before we begin, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves powerful stories of faith and revival. Now, let's go back to a small refugee village in 1727, where this extraordinary story began. In the early 18th century, Europe was restless. Wars had scarred the continent, political tensions simmered between empires. Religious institutions existed everywhere, yet spiritual vitality was fading in many places. Churches functioned, sermons were preached, rituals continued, but something essential felt absent. People sensed it. Faith had become, for many, a matter of tradition rather than transformation. But in the quiet countryside of what is now Germany, something unusual was about to begin. Not through famous theologians, not through powerful institutions, but through a small group of refugees searching for a place to live in peace. These refugees were part of a scattered Protestant movement whose roots trace back to the teachings of the Czech reformer Jan Hus. Hus had preached nearly 2 centuries earlier that the authority of Christ stood above the authority of corrupt religious systems. For preaching such ideas, he was condemned. In Council of Constance, he was burned at the stake in 1415, but ideas are difficult to destroy. His followers continued quietly across regions of Bohemia and Moravia, forming what became known as the Unity of the Brethren. For generations they endured persecution. Their churches were burned, their gatherings outlawed, their leaders imprisoned, so they scattered. Some lived secretly in forests, others disguised their faith while waiting for a safer time. They carried with them a stubborn conviction that Christianity was meant to be lived deeply, not merely practiced outwardly. By the early 1700s, a small group of these believers began searching for refuge, and their journey led them to the estate of a young German nobleman, Count Nikolaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf was not an ordinary aristocrat. Though born into wealth and influence, he had grown up with an unusual spiritual intensity. As a child, he reportedly wrote letters to Jesus and spoke of wanting to live entirely for Christ. But even he did not yet realize what was about to unfold on his land. In 1722, a group of refugees arrived at his estate in Saxony, seeking permission to settle there. Zinzendorf agreed. He gave them land on a hillside where they began building a small village. They named it Herrnhut. The name meant something profound. Under the Lord's watch, at first, the settlement looked like any other struggling refugee community. Homes were simple, food was limited. People came from different backgrounds with different traditions. Some were descendants of the old Hussite believers, others were Lutherans, some were Pietists. And as often happens, when passionate believers gather, disagreements emerged quickly. Theological disputes began. Arguments about doctrine surfaced. Small tensions slowly threatened to fracture the fragile community before it had even properly begun. Zinzendorf watched carefully. He understood something important. A spiritual community cannot survive long on shared ideas alone. It requires shared humility, so he began visiting the settlement regularly. Not as a distant landlord, but as a shepherd. He listened to disputes. He counseled families. He encouraged forgiveness. Slowly, patiently, he guided them toward unity not through force, but through spiritual focus. Yet even with his efforts, the tensions continued. At one point, the divisions grew so serious that the community seemed close to collapsing entirely. But sometimes the breaking point becomes the turning point. In 1727, Zinzendorf proposed something simple. Instead of arguing endlessly about doctrine, the community would commit themselves to prayer. Not occasional prayer, not scheduled prayer alone, but sincere, collective seeking of God. Families began gathering in small groups to pray. Neighbors visited one another to confess offenses. People who had argued publicly began reconciling privately. Something began shifting. Then, on August 13, 1727, the entire community gathered for a communion service in the village church. What happened that day would later become one of the most remarkable spiritual moments in church history. Many who were present described the same experience. A sudden and overwhelming sense of God's presence filled the gathering. People wept, not from sadness, but from a deep awareness of grace. Long-standing resentments dissolved, old divisions vanished. The community later described that moment as a spiritual outpouring unlike anything they had known. Zinzendorf himself said it felt as if the Holy Spirit had united their hearts in a way no human effort could accomplish. The atmosphere in Herrnhut changed almost overnight. People who once debated theology now prayed together with deep affection. Homes became places of worship, songs filled the village, and a hunger for God began to grow stronger each day. Then something unexpected happened. A small group of believers felt compelled to organize continuous prayer. Not just daily prayer meetings, but prayer that would never stop. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They created a schedule where individuals would take 1-hour prayer slots. When one person finished praying, another would immediately take their place. The prayer chain would continue without interruption. At first, it was simply an experiment, but the commitment held. Hour after hour, day after day, week after week. Soon it became clear that something extraordinary had begun. The prayer did not stop. Morning prayers turned into afternoon prayers. Afternoon prayers carried into night watches. Night watches moved into dawn. Children grew up watching adults faithfully keep their prayer hours. Visitors who arrived at the settlement noticed a remarkable atmosphere. It was not dramatic, not chaotic, but deeply peaceful, as if the entire village lived with a constant awareness of God's presence. The prayer chain continued 4 months, then years, then decades. What had begun in a small refugee village was becoming something much larger. Because prayer, when sustained with sincerity, often begins to expand outward. And that is exactly what began happening in Herrnhut. The people praying day and night began sensing something unexpected stirring in their hearts. A growing concern for people far beyond their village, for tribes they had never met, for nations they had never seen. For people who had never even heard the name of Christ, the prayers were beginning to change them. And soon, those prayers would ignite one of the most astonishing missionary movements the world had ever seen. But the story of how a small prayer meeting turned into a global movement is only just beginning. The prayer continued, hour after hour, day after day, night after night. In the small village of Herrnhut, the prayer watch had become part of daily life. Farmers prayed before heading to their fields. Mothers prayed while caring for children. Workers prayed during the quiet hours of the night. What began as a spiritual response to division was becoming something much deeper. Prayer was changing the people themselves. At first, the focus of their prayers had been internal unity, forgiveness, spiritual renewal. But as months passed, their prayers began turning outward. They began praying for people they had never met, for lands they had never seen, for entire nations they only knew from scattered stories. It was unusual. Most Christian communities at the time focused almost entirely on their own local needs. Missionary work beyond Europe was rare and often limited to large institutional efforts. But something different was happening among these believers. Their prayers were awakening a profound burden for the world. And the catalyst for what came next arrived through an unexpected encounter. One day, a formerly enslaved African man visited Herrnhut. His name was Anthony Ulrich. He spoke about the brutal conditions endured by enslaved people in the Caribbean islands. Many had never heard the gospel. Many had never even been allowed to learn to read. Their lives were controlled entirely by plantation owners, and very few Christians had attempted to reach them. For the people of Herrnhut, hearing this testimony was deeply unsettling. They had been praying for the world. But now the world suddenly had a face, a story, a suffering population that seemed almost unreachable. The question began circulating quietly among them: what if someone went? At the time, missionary travel was extremely dangerous. Ships could take months to cross the Atlantic. Diseases spread quickly on long voyages, and even if someone survived the journey, access to enslaved populations was tightly controlled by plantation owners who had little interest in religious instruction. For most people, such barriers would have ended the conversation. But the Moravians had been praying continuously for years. And prayer has a way of reshaping what people consider possible. Two young men in the community began sensing a personal calling to go. Their names were Johann Leonhard Dober and David Nichman. Neither man was famous. Neither had formal theological training. One was a potter, the other a carpenter. Yet both felt an overwhelming conviction that the people suffering in the Caribbean needed to hear about Christ. But there was a problem. Plantation owners rarely allowed missionaries to speak with enslaved workers. So the two men proposed something extraordinary. If necessary, they would sell themselves into slavery in order to live among the people they hoped to reach. Whether this plan would actually have been allowed is debated by historians. But the seriousness of their commitment was unquestionable. They were willing to give up their freedom for the sake of the gospel. When the village gathered to discuss the possibility of sending them, the atmosphere was heavy with emotion. No one knew that they would survive the journey. Travel alone could take months. Life expectancy in tropical regions was extremely low for Europeans at the time. But the community had been praying for years, and now the moment had arrived to act. So in 1732, the Moravian community commissioned Dober and Nichman as missionaries. They boarded a ship bound for the Caribbean island of St. Thomas. As the ship prepared to leave the harbour, friends and family gathered on the shore. Many knew they might never see these men again. Some accounts describe a powerful moment as the ship slowly pulled away. Standing on the deck, one of the missionaries reportedly shouted words that would later become famous among the Moravians. "May the lamb that was slain receive the reward of his suffering." Those words captured the heart of their movement. This was not about adventure, not about fame, not about building institutions. It was about devotion to Christ. And if Christ had suffered to redeem humanity, then reaching the lost was worth any cost. The two men arrived in St. Thomas after a difficult voyage. Conditions were harsh. The island's economy depended heavily on enslaved labor. Plantation owners controlled access to workers and were often suspicious of religious outsiders. But the missionaries began slowly. They built relationships. They listened to stories. They lived simply among the people, and over time, the message of Christ began spreading quietly among the enslaved population. What started with two men soon inspired many others. Back in Herrnhut, the prayer watch continued, 24 hours a day, year after year. And as they prayed, more people began sensing the same call. They began volunteering to go where the need seemed greatest. Some sailed to Greenland, others traveled to North America. Some went to South Africa, others journeyed into remote parts of the Caribbean and South America. What made this movement remarkable was not just where they went, it was who they were. They were ordinary people, farmers, carpenters, tailors, potters, servants. Many had little education, but they carried something powerful with them, a deep spiritual conviction born from years of prayer, and their willingness to endure hardship was extraordinary. Some missionaries died within months of arriving in new lands. Diseases claimed many. Others faced violent opposition. Yet the flow of volunteers never seemed to stop, because the prayer in Herrnhut never stopped either. The two were connected. The prayer sustained the mission, and the mission fueled the prayer. Within just a few decades, this small community of a few hundred people had sent missionaries across multiple continents. It was unprecedented. No Protestant group had ever mobilized missions at such scale before, and the influence of their work would soon reach far beyond their own movement. Their example would inspire future missionaries and revival leaders, people who would carry the same vision into new generations. One of those future leaders would later say that the Moravians had shown the church something it had forgotten, that sustained prayer could reshape the destiny of entire nations. But the most astonishing part of the Moravian story was still unfolding, because the prayer meeting that started in 1727 did not fade after a few years. It continued, year after year, decade after decade, for more than a century. And as the prayer continued, the influence of this small village began quietly spreading into some of the most important spiritual movements in modern history. By the 1730s, the quiet village of Herrnhut had already become something remarkable. A community of refugees had turned into a center of prayer. A prayer meeting had turned into a missionary movement, and ordinary believers had begun traveling to distant lands with a level of courage that surprised even seasoned church leaders. But the influence of the Moravians was about to reach far beyond their missionary efforts. It would soon touch one of the most important revival movements in modern Christian history. And the story begins not in Germany, but on a ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean. In 1735, a young Anglican minister, John Wesley, boarded a ship bound for the American colony of Georgia. Wesley was deeply religious. He prayed regularly. He studied the Bible intensely. He fasted, disciplined himself, and pursued moral perfection with relentless determination. Yet despite all of his efforts, something troubled him. Deep down, he was unsure whether he truly possessed the faith he preached. He feared that his Christianity might be more intellectual than spiritual, more disciplined than transformed. Still, he hoped that serving as a missionary in America would resolve his doubts. On the ship traveling across the Atlantic, Wesley noticed something unusual about a group of fellow passengers. They were Moravians, members of the same movement that had begun years earlier in Herrnhut under the leadership of Count Nikolaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf. At first, Wesley simply observed them from a distance. They seemed humble, quiet, unconcerned with impressing others. They worked alongside the crew when needed, helped other passengers, and gathered regularly for prayer and worship. But what caught Wesley's attention most was their composure. They carried themselves with a calm confidence that he found difficult to explain. Then one night, a violent storm struck the ship. The Atlantic waves crashed against the vessel with terrifying force. Wind tore through the sails. Passengers screamed. Many feared the ship would break apart before morning. Wesley later wrote that he himself felt genuine fear during the storm. But as chaos erupted around the ship, something remarkable happened. The Moravians began singing, not shouting in panic, not scrambling for safety. They sang hymns, calmly, peacefully. Even as waves slammed against the ship, Wesley was astonished. After the storm subsided, he approached one of them and asked a simple question. "Were you not afraid?" The Moravian replied that they trusted completely in Christ. Then he asked Wesley another question. "Do you know Jesus Christ?" Wesley answered that he knew Christ as the Savior of the world. But the Moravian pressed further. "Do you know that he has saved you?" The question unsettled Wesley. He realized that while he believed Christian doctrine, he lacked the deep assurance these believers seemed to possess. They had something he did not: a quiet certainty, a peace rooted not in discipline, but in grace. Wesley continued his mission in Georgia, but the experience troubled him. Eventually, discouraged and spiritually exhausted, he returned to England. He felt like a failure. His missionary effort had not gone well. His inner doubts remained unresolved, yet the memory of the Moravians stayed with him. Back in London, Wesley began meeting with small groups of believers who were influenced by Moravian spirituality. They gathered to study scripture, pray, and discuss faith. One evening in May 1738, Wesley reluctantly attended a meeting on Aldersgate Street. Someone in the group was reading from Martin Luther's commentary on the Book of Romans. As Wesley listened, something unexpected happened. He later described the moment in words that have been repeated in church history ever since. He wrote, near coal mines. Wherever people would listen, thousands gathered, then tens of thousands. The movement that emerged became known as across the world. Some estimate that at one point, nearly 1 in every 12 members of the Moravian community was serving overseas. It was an extraordinary level of commitment, and the driving force behind it all remained the same: prayer, continuous, persistent, unbroken. But the greatest legacy of the Moravians was not simply the missions they launched or the revival movements they influenced. It was the spiritual as the 100-year prayer meeting. But what made the movement extraordinary was not just the duration of prayer. It was what emerged from it, because while the people of Herrnhut were praying, they were also going. Missionaries began leaving the village in increasing numbers, not sponsored by powerful governments. Endured brutal climates. Others faced isolation in remote locations. Many died young from diseases that were poorly understood at the time. Yet the willingness to go never seemed to diminish. Because back in Herrnhut, the prayer never stopped. The connection between prayer and mission remained unbroken. Every missionary departure was surrounded by prayer. Every report from distant lands returned to a praying community. The movement functioned almost like and harsh living conditions made survival itself a daily challenge. Another group went to Surrey. And was willing to serve others. They could share the gospel. This approach opened the door for a much broader missionary movement, and many later Protestant mission societies would adopt similar ideas. The Moravians also emphasized living among the people they served rather than imposing foreign cultural structures. They sought to understand and still continued. Children who were born in Herrnhut grew up seeing prayer watches as normal. They saw parents quietly leaving home at midnight for their assigned prayer hour. They watched neighbors gather before sunrise to pray for missionaries thousands of miles away. For them, prayer was not an occasional religious activity. It was woven into daily life. But as the decades passed, something even more remarkable became clear. The influence of the Moravian movement was spreading far beyond their own churches. Other Christian leaders began noticing what had happened in Herrnhut. They saw how sustained prayer had produced unity, how unity had produced mission, and how mission had reshaped global Christianity. The Moravians had demonstrated a spiritual pattern that many later movements would attempt to follow. Prayer first, mission second, revival flowing naturally from both. Their example would inspire future missionary pioneers, leaders who would carry similar visions into the 19th century and beyond. Yet despite their growing influence, the Moravians themselves remained remarkably humble. They rarely sought attention. They avoided building large public reputations. For them, the focus remained simple: Christ, prayer, service, and the Lamb who was worthy to receive the reward of his suffering. But eventually, every movement faces a moment of transition. The generations that had begun the prayer watch in 1727 would not live forever. New leaders would rise, new challenges would appear, and the question would eventually emerge: what would happen when the 100-year prayer meeting finally came to an end? For more than a century, the prayer continued, day after day, night after night. In the quiet settlement of Herrnhut, believers faithfully kept their prayer hours. The commitment that began in 1727 had passed through multiple generations. Children had grown up watching their parents rise in the middle of the night to pray. Those children had become adults who now carried the same responsibility. And through wars, political changes, and cultural shifts across Europe, the Moravian prayer watch remained unbroken. It became one of the longest sustained prayer movements in recorded Christian history. But eventually, time changes every movement. The generation that had experienced the spiritual outpouring of August 13, 1727 gradually passed away. The remarkable leader who had helped guide the early community, Count Nikolaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf, died in 1760. Yet even after his death, the spiritual momentum he had helped nurture continued. By this point, the Moravian movement had already spread far beyond Germany. Communities had formed in England, congregations existed in North America, mission stations operated across the Caribbean, Africa, and the Arctic regions. The Moravians had become a global presence, not through conquest, not through political influence, but through prayer and perseverance. Historians often point to a remarkable statistic that captures the scale of what happened. By the late 18th century, the Moravians had sent hundreds of missionaries across the world, and they had done so from a community that never numbered more than a few thousand people. In proportion to their size, they had become one of the most mission-driven Christian groups in history. Their missionaries had traveled to places that many Europeans of the time considered unreachable. Some had served among enslaved populations in the Caribbean islands. Others had lived among indigenous tribes in North America. Still others endured the brutal climates of the Arctic, while ministering in places like Greenland. Many died young. Diseases that modern medicine now treats easily often proved fatal in the 18th century. But the missionaries who volunteered rarely expected comfortable lives. They expected sacrifice because the message they carried was, to them, worth everything. And behind every missionary journey stood the same foundation: prayer, continuous, persistent, faithful. Eventually, after more than 100 years, the original prayer chain in Herrnhut slowly came to an end. Not because people had lost faith, but because the movement had already spread so widely. Prayer meetings now existed in Moravian communities across multiple continents. The spiritual fire that began in one village had multiplied into many places. In a sense, the prayer meeting had not truly ended, it had simply expanded. The influence of the Moravians would continue shaping Christian history in quiet but powerful ways. Their example helped inspire later missionary pioneers such as William Carey, whose efforts in the late 18th century, the modern Protestant missionary movement. Their emphasis on prayer and personal devotion influenced revival leaders throughout the 19th century. Even the Methodist movement associated with John Wesley had been indirectly shaped by Moravian spirituality decades earlier. In many ways, the Moravians had helped restore a powerful idea to the Christian world, that sustained prayer could reshape history, not through political power, not through institutional dominance, but through quiet faithfulness. They demonstrated that ordinary believers, when united by prayer and purpose, could influence nations. And perhaps the most remarkable part of their story is how unlikely it all seemed at the beginning. The Moravians were not a large movement. They did not begin with wealth or influence. They were refugees, people who had fled persecution, people who simply wanted a place to worship freely. Yet from that small beginning came a movement that reached across the globe. Their story challenges a common assumption. Many people believe that great change always begins with great power. But the Moravian story suggests something different. Sometimes history shifts in quiet places, in small communities, in prayer meetings that no one else notices. When the Moravians first began praying around the clock in 1727, they had no idea that their commitment would eventually influence global missions, shape revival movements, and inspire generations of believers. They simply prayed, faithfully, consistently, trusting that God could do far more than they could imagine, and history suggests that He did. Today, the story of the Moravians continues to circulate among historians, theologians, and spiritual leaders as one of the most remarkable examples of what sustained prayer can produce. Not because the Moravians were perfect, not because they possessed extraordinary resources, but because they believed something deeply, that devotion to Christ was worth organizing life around, worth sacrificing comfort for, worth carrying across oceans and continents. And perhaps that is the real legacy of the Moravians. Not just the missionaries they sent, not just the revival movements they influenced, but the spiritual principle they demonstrated, that a small group of committed people, when united in prayer and purpose, can ignite a movement that echoes across centuries. The village of Herrnhut still exists today, quiet, ordinary, much like it was when those first refugees arrived seeking shelter. Yet its history carries a powerful reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary movements in history begin not with crowds, but with a few people willing to pray, and keep praying, day and night, year after year, until the world begins to change. The story of the Moravians reminds us that some of the greatest movements in history do not begin with crowds, power, or influence. They begin quietly with a few people who refuse to stop praying. In a small village called Herrnhut, ordinary believers committed themselves to seek God day and night. What began as a prayer meeting among refugees became a fire that spread across continents. Missionaries crossed oceans, revival movements were sparked, and generations were inspired, all because a small community believed that prayer could change the world. Their legacy still echoes today. It reminds us that when people devote themselves fully to God, even the smallest beginning can produce a global impact. If this story inspired you, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And before you go, drop a comment below. What part of the Moravian story impacted you the most?